If the police decide to abolish themselves, which is, an unlikely situation.
The scary, scary anarchy.
Oh, you have me blushing. If they're calling themselves Andrewists, because that would mean that I have failed totally. Competition is part of who we are, but so is cooperation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Solarpunk Manifesto for this fourth episode with Andrew Sage from the YouTube channel Andrewism.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start the discussion, let me give you a quick preview of what Andrew's work consists of. In his video essays, Andrew takes us along in his process of learning and unlearning as he embarks us on a journey to figure out why our world is the way it is and what might be required of us to make it better. He covers a wide range of topics, from Black anarchism to homeschooling, and his videos are solarpunk in essence because his critique and reading of human societies is sharp, unforgiving, yet full of hope and geared towards action. His channel has a really cool, pretty, and colorful aesthetic with really well-curated videos that contain lots of images and examples and historical references. So you should definitely check it out, and I promise you will leave the space feeling energized and full of fresh perspective.
Oh, you have me blushing.
That was our little declaration before starting the discussion.
Yeah, now that we've introduced you, Andrew, so for everyone who's listening, Andrew's channel is called Andrewism. Go search it up on YouTube. But in order to start, I think it's fair outlining the Andrewism as a political philosophy. So you describe yourself as the one and only Andrewist. Andrew, can you briefly describe to our listeners what encompasses the Andrewist ideology?
Yeah, so that's the whole thing about it. It's not really like an ideology. It's like a non-ideology. Or I suppose to be more specific, it's a hyper-specific ideology. Andrewism is really just the term that I've given for my evolving worldview. There's no canon to reference, or there's no set in stone prescription. It's just, my worldview as it changes with education and learning and unlearning. And it is heavily informed by anarchism, I would say, for sure, and its principles of autonomy and horizontality and direct action and free association and self-liberation. I'm actually working on a video right now to clarify and organize anarchism as a concept. But that is what I would say informs my ideology the most. I think anarchism is just one part of Andrewism, which is really just my present and ever-changing worldview. And I really call myself the one and only Andrewist because I want people to think for themselves and challenge themselves to develop their own way of thinking and their own worldview, and to constantly seek education and learning rather than limiting themselves to the thoughts or ideas of specific thinkers from history or whenever.
So, Andrew, you speak of anarchism as quite integral to your philosophy. However fluid it is still quite central to how you perceive the world. And you've also spoken in your videos against this concept of the capital R revolution, which probably, if we're realistic, is the only way to achieve such an anarchist organization for our human society. But can you tell us more about the dangers of the capital R revolution and what revolution actually means to you?
Yeah, so I rail against the capital R revolution because I think it really strikes me more as this sort of millenarian, almost rapture or second coming concept, rather than something that people should recognize that they are acting to shape here and now. So my conception of revolution is really focused on the anarchist idea of social revolution. And social revolution is no less than a complete transformation of our society, economy, culture, philosophy, technology, relationships, and politics. This process might be punctuated by major ruptures and insurrections. I don't deny that. When I speak about revolution, I talk about acts to confront the system, to refuse cooperation with the system, and to prefigure a new system in the shell of the old. But when I critique this idea of capital R revolution, I'm critiquing this idea that revolution is just one broad stroke event, when in reality it's this heterogeneous process occurring simultaneously in various places and at various paces. Rather, I think I should probably define what anarchism is for the listeners, at least how I define it, because it's certainly something that is misunderstood by non-anarchists and even some self-identifying anarchists. In fact, I think anarchism is one of those terms that has existed with a constant struggle of meaning, which has also helped to shape what it is. I would say anarchism is a political philosophy and practice that opposes all hierarchies along with their justifying dogmas, and proposes the unending pursuit of anarchy, which is a world without rule in any form, and a world where free association, self-determination, and mutual aid form the basis of our society.
Well, we'll get to a broader discussion of anarchy in a second, but I think we would like to start off with a few questions on Solarpunk, just to ease our Solarpunk Manifesto listeners into this Anarchist Manifesto, perhaps? Or Solarpunk Anarchist Manifesto?
For sure.
So you've made quite a few videos on Solarpunk, actually, and you've also been in quite a few like webinars and invited on other people's platforms. Could you share with us your personal journey with Solarpunk and maybe explain how it has influenced your lifestyle?
Sure. So I stumbled upon Solarpunk, I would say in like the mid-2010s, somewhere around there, while I was on Tumblr. And I found it very visually inspiring because as a child growing up and into my teenhood and into my young adulthood, I've always been interested in world building and this idea of conceptualizing new worlds. In fact, when I think I was 5 or 6 or 7, somewhere around there, I was already writing stories about alternative worlds and alternative futures. So when I discovered Solarpunk on Tumblr, I was like, wow, look at this visual representation of some of the things that I've been exploring for years. But I didn't do much beyond bookmark it and say, wow, that's cool. It's only until I really started my channel and I began exploring not just the aesthetic, but some of the principles that have come to guide Solarpunk, that I was able to not just communicate what Solarpunk has been, but also through my platform shape what Solarpunk can be. Because Solarpunk is an aesthetic that is guided by specific principles. It's a movement, but there are many different ways that one can interpret and develop, and so many directions that Solarpunk could potentially go in. And I don't think that should be changed. I appreciate how diverse the Solarpunk movement is in terms of the various ideas people come up with and how they want to express it. But I think it's necessary to use my platform to shape at least one perception of Solarpunk and one interpretation of Solarpunk in a notably anarchic direction, because I think Solarpunk is uniquely conducive to that particular interpretation. And I think that anarchism is able to address some of the shortcomings that Solarpunk might face so that we can retain the essence of Solarpunk while also responding and adapting to our present reality through ideas of like anarchist praxis and that sort of thing. As for how it influenced my lifestyle, I'd say that on an individual level, I tend to do a bit of gardening and some self-education, and occasionally link up with others from time to time to work on shared projects related to the land.
So I would like to spin it back to something that you just mentioned, and you said that you find Solarpunk and anarchism to be complementary. Could you speak a bit more about this? Because I think for a listener and for me as well, it's not self-evident in which way Solarpunk and anarchy are conducive of creating something that is complementary and beneficial to both the movements.
Sure. For me, Solarpunk is sort of a window dressing from anarchist principles, because, like I said, I don't think there is this necessarily coherent and consistent Solarpunk ideology. So I had to custom build my understanding of Solarpunk out of my evolving understanding of anarchism. There's those inspired by Solarpunk who might consider themselves just, environmentalists or communalists or Marxists or whatever. But my focus has really been on how the aesthetics of Solarpunk can provide a vehicle for me to communicate anarchist ideas and organizing principles of free association, direct action, mutual aid, that sort of thing. I think Solarpunk and anarchism are compatible because of Solarpunk's emphasis on community building, on interconnectedness, on sustainable practices, on participatory social organization, and on rebuilding our relationship to the land and the natural environment.
Right. But in your quest on developing anarchy through a solarpunk lens, have you come across any issues when trying to seek this complementarity? Have you found them to conflict in any way?
I haven't recognized conflict between anarchism and solarpunk. There are certain perceptions or conceptions of solarpunk that I wouldn't say are necessarily compatible with anarchism, or at least an anarchism that is informed by social ecology. Things like representations of solarpunk that rely on these massive concrete skyscrapers and megastructures, like these greenwashing elements present within some ideas and manifestations of solarpunk. I would say that is what would conflict with anarchism, or maybe some conceptions of solarpunk that see it as like Singapore, which is, very clearly an authoritarian regime that is not consistent with the communal and egalitarian principles found in both anarchism and solarpunk. But other than that, I haven't seen any major clashes between solarpunk and anarchism.
Yeah, to us, it also seems like one of the biggest issues about solarpunk right now is the prevalence of the greenwashy aesthetic. And that's also something that we are set out to debunk, this myth of everything is supposed to look like Singapore in the world, whereas that is actually not solarpunk at all. So we very much agree with you on this one, and let's hope that with this Solarpunk Manifesto and with Andrewism videos, we can spread the word about solarpunk being something more than just these images of AI-generated megastructures.
For sure.
I just wanted to say something else on the aesthetic, because in one of your videos, Andrew, I was looking at the comments.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like someone from, I don't remember what kind of desertic country, that was saying how they didn't relate to the lush green aesthetic because it's just not realistic also
Yes.
to expect the future to look all green, because clearly the climatic conditions are not even going to allow it in certain areas. It's just not what it looks like in many places.
Yeah, I mean, that's a criticism I certainly echo. For now, the dominant portrayal of solarpunk has been mostly in a temperate and occasionally in a tropical climate context. In fact, the reason I launched the solarpunk art collaboration last year in 2023 was so that I could encourage people to conceptualize solarpunk settings in other bioregions, in deserts and in xeric shrublands and in grasslands, in Arctic and Antarctic regions. The development of solarpunk aesthetics in settings that have not yet been explored. And I mean, we're still in the early stages of that. I mean, some people definitely answered the call, and there's some beautiful depictions of solarpunk in new settings that are covered in that collaboration, which I published on my Tumblr, Andrewism. But there haven't been enough imaginary portrayals of solarpunk in those settings. And I think we could stand to see that a lot more.
Yeah.
For sure.
For sure. And one more thing actually about the aesthetics and the futurology of the whole solarpunk future is something that Andrew Dana Hudson, the guy we interviewed for the first episode, talked about, and something that I never thought about before reading his essay on the political dimensions of solarpunk. But he very clearly talks about the fact that we have an aging population, and that we should, when we're thinking about the future, we should take into account the fact that it's going to be filled with predominantly older people, and that a lot of the efforts within the societies should be about care for these older populations. And that is something, of course, that is not taken into account because most of the solarpunk art is generated by younger people.
Yes, as part of the broader conversation, I think, of accessibility and depicting accessibility in solarpunk. I've seen some of the artists who worked on that solarpunk art collaboration that I launched did make an effort to depict disability and accessibility in the solarpunk setting. And I know that one prominent solarpunk artist, I think the solarpunk artist for some, that's Dustin Jacobus, definitely does a lot to, or has done some art that promotes or presents the disabled and the elderly in a solarpunk setting.
Right. Now let's leeway back into anarchy, into the scary, scary anarchy, something you don't want to talk to your parents about because they're going to ground you because evidently you're going down the wrong path in life.
Before talking about anarchy, we know that behind every political philosophy is a view of human nature. And given the system we are in and the predominant political philosophy which has won over the others, many argue that humans are inherently competitive and self-interested, suggesting that this is incompatible with anarchism. Andrew, how would you counter this argument? And what does anarchist theory propose about human nature and cooperation?
I agree that any political philosophy has some sort of take or interpretation on human nature. Anarchism is certainly no exception. I think what distinguishes the anarchist perception of human nature from these sorts of narratives of inherent competitiveness and self-interest is that anarchists are able to recognize those traits in the context of our proclivity to mutual aid as a species, because we are a social species. Humans are mutually interdependent. We can't get away from the fact that we rely upon each other. The idea that competition really tells the full story stems from the misunderstanding of natural selection and ignorance of mutual aid as a vital factor in our evolution, and a confusion of the behaviors and attitudes developed in the context of a very specific socioeconomic system as the full range of our potential as a species. It would be like looking at a person in a house fire and concluding that it is in human nature to cook. The conditions of the society we find ourselves within shapes the way that we act, shapes the way that we think, shapes the way that we perceive the world. And I mean, competition is part of who we are, but so is cooperation. Self-interest is part of who we are, but depending on how you organize society, that self-interest can either aid our cooperation or harm our cooperation. It is absolutely possible and quite usual for pro-social behavior in the form of helping others and developing bonds of cooperation to come back and benefit yourself. And by helping others, you build positive relationships with them. When you help people in their times of need, they tend to help you back. This is all mutual aid. By assisting each other, we all benefit and come out better and more secure. When we have conditions where you are incentivized to pursue your self-interest at the harm of others, at the behest of others, that's when we have a situation like what we have under capitalism, where people are ruthlessly competitive and constantly seeking to one-up each other and to screw over each other. Hierarchical societies and egalitarian societies would shape the people within them in different ways. And I think at the end of the day, human nature is really, or rather the appeal to human nature that is often used to argue against ideas like anarchism or socialism, I think it's a simplification of our complexity as a species. It's a spit in the face of the variety of our potential. I think it's a shortcut that gets in the way of us to avoid confronting our preconceived notions and prejudices and assumptions. It's also, I think, a tool of propaganda that serves to limit our imagination, including our imagination of solarpunk possibilities.
I would like to add on that, and not to shy away from the quote that you used from the social ecology book. Actually, I would like to just give our listeners the quote, because I was just looking it up yesterday to mention it to my dad, actually. To look at people in capitalist society and conclude that human nature is egoism is like looking at people in a factory where pollution is destroying their lungs and saying that it is human nature to cough. Because I think this one is more conducive than the house on fire. Because capitalism is a little bit more straightforward.
Yes, for sure. I think another aspect of the whole human nature discussion is that I think anarchists are accused often of demanding too much from human nature, but I think in many ways we're more honest about it. If human nature is really as wicked, as corrupt as some people say that it is, then providing people with avenues to exert power over others would be a terrible mistake. It would be setting ourselves up a field. It would be better to organize ourselves around avoiding that concentration of power and avoiding that capacity to harm others in such an amplified manner.
But do you think that there's a critical size of communities or societies at which it is unavoidable to create hierarchies? Because that is also one of the big arguments that is used. Like, how do you scale anarchy?
Yeah, so I think that, for one, the idea of Dunbar's number and such, from what I've seen, is not entirely like a settled discussion in the field of sociology. But as it relates to the necessity of hierarchy, I think we are more than capable of organizing cooperatively, organizing horizontally, and not relying on like a relation of command and subordination to accomplish tasks. When anarchists speak about free association, we're referring to the ability of free individuals to come together at points of consensus, at points of collaboration, at shared goals or projects or aims, and working together on the basis of that consensus to pursue those goals, those projects, those aims. So you don't have a situation where you have this rigid firm or organization that is demanding that all parts of it pursue a particular task, but rather you have a situation where people freely decide, come together at the points of their needs, at the points of their desires, to pursue those interests collaboratively. There are certain organizational structures or certain projects, or there might be certain ambitions that do require the coercion or the subordination of people to accomplish. And that is a question that I think anarchists have to grapple with. But then anarchists are grappling with it because it does cause us to ask, if somebody needs to be subordinated, this system of rank and this hierarchy of command and subordination, is that thing necessary? Or is there another way we can pursue it? It's like sort of a question, if the only way for us to get rare earth minerals would be to force a Congolese child down a cobalt mine, do we just excuse it and say, oh, we need to get it done? Or we try and find ways where people can freely decide, where people do not need to be coerced and forced and subjugated to pursue certain goals, or in service of certain goals, be sacrificed in service of certain goals? I think another aspect of it is that when we're talking about hierarchy and this necessity of hierarchy, it's very important that we disentangle this concept of hierarchy from concepts that hierarchy tends to get tied up with. This is part of the video that I'm in the process of working on, but part of it involves looking at the way that we tend to conflate hierarchy with things like force, or things like violence, or expertise, or influence, persuasion, coordination. Part of the task of organized anarchy, figuring out ways to organize that is without this relationship of hierarchy, this relationship of command and subordination, is to find ways to coordinate our tasks, or to communicate information, or to recognize expertise, or to do all those things without having to lean on this crutch of this person's at the top. They're the order givers and the order takers, the rulers and the ruled.
I think that the topic of human nature relates to this question of like nature versus nurture, which necessarily leads us to the topic of education. And correct me if I am wrong, but it seems like your interest in political philosophies was sparked by first kind of realization about the role of education as an institution. And your first video actually on your YouTube channel, from dating back from 3 years ago, is called "The Education System is Broken." So how significant is the role of education and upbringing in shaping human nature, according to you? And do you see that a shift in that area, or rethinking the way we educate kids, could promote more cooperative and altruistic behavior?
I have a disclaimer here that Andrew was homeschooled, so he's a little bit biased about this.
Yes, indeed. I would say that my homeschooling experience definitely shaped my perception of what is possible in the realm of education. It really is hard to overstate the significance of education in shaping our human nature and shaping what we end up becoming. And it's something, the realm of education is something that anarchists have long explored and sought to develop theories around and organizational practices around. The free school movement was shaped by anarchists. The Ferrer school movement was also shaped by anarchists. And these are both instances where there was an orientation of education around the autonomy and self-development of the child, where children were free to pursue their education, to be guided in their education in ways that amplified their autonomy. My vision of what precisely an ideal education system would look like is something that I'm still shaping. It's something I'm still doing research on. I'm planning on doing a video on it fairly soon, where I'm going to be looking at some of the history of anarchist attempts at education in the past, and also non-anarchists as well, like Ivan Illich. But I would agree with Ivan Illich in saying that society needs to be, in some respects, de-schooled. This is also another instance where it's very important to separate this notion of this broad or vague notion of hierarchy from some of the concepts that it has come to be associated with. A lot of people reference the relationship between a teacher and student as an example of a beneficial hierarchy or a needed hierarchy. But rather, it is necessary to look at this tutelary or caring relation as something that we can construct without depending on command. And that's something that anarchists have experimented with, because anarchists can recognize that, yes, teachers and students are unequal in knowledge in certain given subjects. But if we can disentangle the tasks that are necessary for education from the tasks that are necessary for control or for these disciplinary roles that teachers often end up having to take in the context of a hierarchical education structure, then the educational relationship can be rebuilt as a free association between different types of learners, rather than the sort of banking model that Paulo Freire talks about in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We could be looking at a more, what's the term he uses again?
About the purpose of schooling.
Right. He uses as opposed to the banking model that Paulo Freire references, we could look at a more problem-posing model, one that looks to develop the children's freedom and the children's ability to think critically and to organize themselves without submitting to authority.
Yeah, I think Freire is also one of my favorites. But the thing is that, I feel it's really difficult. For example, when I go to a classroom and I having read Freire and his vision of school as being a place where the teacher teaches the kids to reflect on their social position and on the dynamics of oppression that they might recognize throughout the group. I find this so powerful, and I see how much energy and kind of revolutionary impulse it could create in kids. I've been trying to think about how can we include that in classrooms in the mainstream education, and I think it's really against certain interests that those centralized forms of education have. But relating to children and childhood, you talk about a concept that's called the psychological mask. So it's about this thing of unlearning, right? So could you maybe explain to the listeners what the psychological mask is?
Sure. The mask is a concept that I got from Ashanti Alston. He is a Black anarchist who was a former member of the Black Panther Party. He came to anarchism after the dissolution of the Black Panther Party due to various internal issues, as well as the assault of the COINTELPRO project of the FBI. In an article that he wrote called Childhood and the Psychological Dimension of Revolution, he basically describes the mask as a psychological prison that is fitted onto us from an early age so that we can conform to the program of society. As he says, basically, there's no child that just automatically conforms to authoritarian reason. There's always some degree of rebellion and resistance. But because of your dependence, you're socially dependent upon the authorities around you, you have no choice really but to conform to their designs. And so you end up repressing, the process ends up repressing some of the child's natural zest for life, and to end up shaping the child towards the customs and traditions and ideologies that they are just subsumed within. Before you know it, as he says, every aspect, the mask ends up becoming part of your physical, mental, and emotional fiber. It becomes a part of you, and to the point where you don't even realize that it's there, and it's governing, and it's influencing all of your activities. It acts as a block from your true feelings, from your spontaneous contact with the outside world, from the authenticity of yourself in favor of this predetermined role within society of age or gender or race or work or some other dimension of the status quo, whether you like it or not.
When we talk about the social revolution and we take education into account, would you say that changing the education so that our children aren't raised to fit into this hierarchical capitalist system comes first? Or do you think that there will be some other change that will, in the end, lead to the fact that we all recognize that children should be brought up with a different mentality in their mind, and then something will change?
So hierarchical systems, part of how they continue themselves is just based on inertia, right? This is the way things have been. This is how things will just continue to be. So you sort of have to find ways to rupture, to break, or to interrupt that inertia. And part of how we do so is in interrupting one of the ways that hierarchy continues itself in the realm of education and child rearing. Now, I do see hints of that in the gentle parenting movement that has been picking up some steam in this generation. But of course, a handful of parents here and there orienting their children or raising their children in a more egalitarian and freer direction alone is not going to be enough to overturn the system entirely. I think that those children on their own, in the context of the way that they were raised, will most likely develop their own analysis of the world around them as they come out of the context of their parents and realize the way that they have been raised is not compatible with the society that they've ended up being cast into. And so, I mean, there are a couple of different ways that they could probably respond to that. And I think one of those ways will involve challenging that society rather than conforming to accept it. But of course, that can't be done in isolation. And so parenting and education will be part of that social revolutionary shift. And you could see in many ways that that's occurring right now, but it has to link up with other efforts to develop our autonomy. I mean, we can't exactly write off the adults and just say, oh, we'll just wait until the children take over and then everything will be honky-dory.
Will be better though, probably. But
Yeah.
I have a question in this regard about the developing countries in which a vast majority of parents' generation, quote unquote, is traumatized and focused on the monetary aspect of success, right?
Yes.
If we're talking about Asia or in fact any other developing country, Russia, you are pressured by your parents to fit in just because otherwise you have no chances of fitting into society. It's a very competitive society there. So these movements of gentle parenting and other movements along the lines, how do you see them fitting into these kind of contexts? Because I can imagine, as a person who has lived both in the East and in Western Europe, I know how kids in Western Europe are, and you can gentle parent them, but can you gentle parent the kids in developing countries as well, in the contemporary context?
I'm glad you raised that, because there actually is a small but developing gentle parenting movement, even in the context of Trinidad. Now, in the Caribbean in general, it's very common. There are a lot of jokes. If you go on social media and you type in Caribbean parents, you're going to see a lot of humorous skits, at least if you grew up in that context. But if you did not grow up in that context, they may not come across as humorous. They might come across as deeply traumatic and terrifying. But I think this generation in particular, there are those that carry on that attitude of parenting, and then there are those who reject the attitude of parenting. And some of them say, I reject that attitude of parenting and I don't plan on having children. And then there are those who say, I reject that form of parenting, that attitude of parenting, and want to explore something different, want to try a different path. I would say that each successive generation, at least in my experience, with exceptions, does tend to pass on less traumas than the generation before them. So, I mean, there are some small victories that I see here and there. For example, several greats ago, one of my great grandmothers would have pelted an iron at one of my great-great-grandmothers or something like that. And I mean, that grandmother would then go on to still beat her children, but at least she didn't throw an iron at their head.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
For example, even my parents' generation, some of them at least, not passing on as much licks as they would have received at their age. Minimal, but at least even in my parents' generation, there are a handful of people. For example, there's this one guy that I know, he might be the generation after my parents, or the generation between me and my parents. But he is raising his son on gentle parenting, or more specifically, on a mix of gentle parenting and the Montessori method of parenting. And he is a fully Trinidadian guy. He's not an expat. He's not a foreigner. So and he's documenting that journey on social media where people can see. And he gets a lot of like strong feedback, of course, because the thing about that sort of parental trauma is that it's very sensitive. So when people get confronted with the fact that there was another way, some people get extremely defensive and they try to fight back and push back against it and say, oh, well, that's not the way, or that couldn't work with me, or da-da-da-da-da, rather than recognizing that maybe there is another way. But thankfully, there are people that you see in his comments who are like, oh, okay, I'm recognizing that there is another way. And thanks to you just showing me that there is another way, I'm trying this with my children, and I'm seeing good results and that kind of thing. So, I mean, while it's true that, in developing countries, there be certain, and of course, it's tough to generalize something as broad as developing countries, but it's true that in, for example, the Caribbean, there are these attitudes of parenting that might be notably authoritarian or traumatic, but I do see, the glimmers of hope that no, it is possible to even push back against that cultural mindset or cultural hegemony of this is the way that you parent children, to sort of, break free of that and pursue a different path, and to see success in doing so.
It's a really interesting concept for me because thinking of gerontology on the scale of human history, it's like, why is it only now that children are starting to improve or to rebel against these deeply rooted systems of domination of your children? Because to me, it seems like we've existed for such a long time and children have always been unhappy and have always been thrown slippers at. I don't know. But why is it only now that it's changing? Is it really the importance of theory that we are realizing, okay, we have to put it down, we have to try the Montessori method, it's right there on paper, so we should all go and try it out? Or is it just because the information is spreading? Or is it because we're moving towards other modes of economic growth, action, and stuff like that?
I think it has a lot to do with, of course, the material conditions, like the change in like just the circumstances in which we live. And I think it's also a matter of, just having more access to information, more knowledge, like more education, that sort of thing. And once you find out once you learn about, for example, the long-term psychological effects of corporal punishment on children, it's hard to justify it after that. I mean, there's still people who do that. Even with that knowledge, they still do that. But I think with education, it becomes harder to justify those methods, and so people start to move away from them. Of course, though, I will also push back against the idea that children have always been unhappy. I think that's a bit too general to say, because there are cultures where children have long exercised and enjoyed a great degree of autonomy. One example that I look at in my parenting video is, I believe, the Hadza. And then in my family video, my video on rethinking family, I also look at the Mbuti people as well, both found in Africa, one in Central and one in East Africa. This is just another mark in favor of the anarchist view of human nature, which looks at the fact that we are actually a lot more pliable and flexible in the way that we organize our society than this one homogenous vision of hierarchical society that capitalism tends to inculcate us with.
Yeah, and I think on relating to parenting, the question of gentle parenting, it's inherently linked to so many other things. You're not going to change things only by gentle parenting things. Like, you also need to think why parents are violent also against their children. And sometimes it's also linked to very structural conditions. So we have to rethink work time. We have to rethink how we value like every job linked to childhood. And I also think gentle parenting has more to do with the adults and the parents than the actual children. Because gentle parenting, it's about your knowing how to be an adult in front of a kid, which is to just be self-aware and know how to deal with your emotions and show this to your kid. So I think it's way more simple than what we imagine it as. And I think gentle parenting is also very much misunderstood. Like, it's not really a new thing. It's more about unlearning
Yeah,
than anything else.
agreed.
So you've just touched upon your cultural background about the state of things in Trinidad and Tobago. And I was just wondering, how has your cultural and personal background formed a fertile ground for you to become an anarchist? Because that's something that you've expressed before.
Yeah, so I think in terms of cultural background, just as I dug into the history of my people, being from a former colony, just looking at colonial history is enough to radicalize you at least somewhat. And also looking at the modes of resistance that were taken, that, we didn't just lie down and take enslavement and indenture and the colonial governance, that we found ways to resist. That was very inspiring to me. Looking particularly at the Maroons, for instance, was very inspiring to me. The fact that they were able to forge new societies in the shell of the old societies has definitely played a part in how I conceptualize the idea of prefiguration and of social revolution. And it's something that, by the way, though I don't think Cory Doctorow was inspired by the Maroons, I think that sentiment is definitely echoed by his book, Walk Away. It's a fictional narrative, but it also does look at this situation where people run away or walk away from a very oppressive society and end up developing a more egalitarian society on the fringes. So I just looking at my anti-colonial history was part of it. Looking at the history of some of the pre-colonial African peoples was a part of it as well. Looking at the resistance, for example, of the Black Power Revolution in 1970, which was a mere 8 years after we gained our independence and people were already dissatisfied with the new colonial governance. And looking at the development of Carnival and the way that Carnival was a sort of a creative protest and means of subversion against the existing order. I mean, since then it has been co-opted in many ways, but that spirit of rebellion does still persist in some ways. In terms of my personal background, to say, of course, my educational experience of being homeschooled definitely shaped my perception of what is possible in the realm of education, or in the realm of children being able to pursue their education without a lot of these restrictions and boundaries that are placed upon them. And another aspect of my background that would have shaped my interest in anarchism was definitely deconstructing my religious background. And yet simultaneously, I was shaped by some of the values that were communicated to me by that religion. I mean, as part of my transition out of Christianity, I had stumbled upon a Christian anarchist, and that was like my first introduction to anarchism. And I mean, since then, I'm not Christian or anything of that nature. But the way that particular person had communicated the values of Christianity and anarchism as compatible was something that I had not considered or seen expressed before in the more authoritarian and conservative orientation of the church that I had grown up in.
So there's a lot of interesting aspects that are quite particular to your background. And perhaps when people find themselves in a situation in which they have a lot of common ground to share, it's quite easy for them to organize into these larger movements, which can definitely be seen in the anti-colonial movements and liberation movements of the 20th century and before. But do you have any suggestions for how, if we were to build this solarpunk future, this anarchist future, how should we build solidarity with groups or movements across geographical and cultural divides? Because sometimes that seems a little bit more problematic than we think.
Yes. So the Indigenous Anarchist Federation has a good article on this, and I did a video on it in collaboration with them. It's called How to Build International Solidarity. But essentially, in pursuit of that goal, we want to look at finding ways to network local associations and currents on the regional, continental, archipelagic, and international scale based on connecting at points of need and at points where there can be mutual aid, at points where there can be mutual context or supplies or skills it starts, I think, on even this scale of this one-on-one, or I guess in this case, two-on-one, or one-on-one-on-one, or whatever scale of just that human connection, building an actual relationship, friendship with people across the barriers of geography and of language and of cultural difference. I mean, it's not easy, but it's only from those points of genuine connection can actually organic and strong bonds of solidarity be built. When we look at the history of anarchist and syndicalist organizing, you see the Italians going over to Spain to assist the Spanish anarchists with their civil war, and you see the Italians going to Egypt and also in the Egyptian syndicalist movement, and you see the Italians going to South Africa. I mean, the Italians were going everywhere, right? But you also see the English anarchists going down to South Africa. You see across the pond, the American anarchists and the European anarchists collaborating and sharing information. And that started at points of exchanges of letters. And I'm not saying you have to dip your feather in ink and write a letter across the ocean. I mean, we have other options now, but there definitely needs to be some level of reaching out. And I mean, we see some degrees of that already in place. When we see the outpouring and the expressions of solidarity towards the people of Gaza, and we see that some of that is based on the fact that people across the world have built relationships with people there, that they're able to communicate on the ground what is going on there, that we are able to expose the reality of the situation and not the narrative that has been manipulated by mass media. That is how we are able to empower ourselves. That is how we're able to push back against narrative. And that is how we are able to build outside of what the ruling class, which wants to keep us divided, is telling us about what people around the world are like. When we can see that is not true, and we could say, actually, I don't agree with you that all Russians are this way, because I met Maxim, and Maxim is, a really cool, chill dude. He's a very intelligent guy, and I've had a lot of interesting conversations with him. I can't say, oh, well, the French are this and that, because I've spoken to Lola. I've spoken to, various other people. You break out of that narrative and that perception, that stereotyping, when you are able to make those direct connections on a human level and build upon those direct connections by finding out, okay, so what is it that you need, or what is it that your people need in this context, and how can we assist, and how can we extend our resources to help you, and so on and so forth. I mean, something as simple as people buying the eSIMs for the people of Gaza, that's an example of the sort of solidarity that can be built across geographical and cultural divides.
Yeah, for me, this is really a crucial aspect of, indeed, the interconnectedness of the world, the possibility to connect nowadays. I recently saw a video of an Irish guy who was explaining why there's so much solidarity for Gaza in Ireland. It's also something that we don't really take into account, that the fact that basically Ireland was colonized. It was
Yes.
under rule. They were not recognized as people, even similarly to other situations around the world. But then you think, why are these white people cheering for these Arabs in the mass media narrative? But then the Irish people say, well, you know what, actually, this is not just about the skin color. This is really just about an approach to other human beings, and that's it. That's full stop. That's the only thing that matters.
Absolutely.
But in terms of culture and skin color, I had a question for you about Ecotopia, because you've mentioned that you've read it. And just to give our listeners a brief introduction to Ecotopia, it's a book written in the 70s by Ernest Kallenbach, who was a guy, he worked at University of Berkeley, and University of Berkeley in the 70s was a birthplace for the ecological thought that we have nowadays. So basically, inspired by that, he created a fictional story where a journalist from America goes to visit this country, Ecotopia, which separated itself from other North American countries like Canada and the United States, to form their own country in which they lived kind of in what we could imagine as the social ecology concept as laid out by Bookchin. So one of the concepts that is spoken about there is actually autosegregation, ethnic autosegregation. So that means that Black people form their own communities, I believe, in San Francisco, and they just live there, all of them. Almost all of them decide to deliberately not live with white people, and that's how they function. And same for Japanese people. So it means that there's basically an autosegregation both parties agreed, there's no tension about it, but that's just how it is. What do you think of this? And do you think that is a desirable outcome or possible outcome for our solarpunk or anarchist future?
When you sent me this question, I did not recall that part in the book, so I actually had to crack open my copy and look through and try and find. And I did find it, and so I read through it again, and so I think that they do mention there are a few African Americans here and there, but most of the African American communities, along with Chinatown, I believe, not the Japanese, but I think it's Chinatown, rather than being absorbed into the surrounding country of Ecotopia, ended up organizing these independent city-states out of the enclaves that had developed prior to segregationist policies of the US government. And so I wouldn't necessarily call it auto-segregation. I think rather it was more of a continuation of what was already in place. Of these people had been in this place, they grew up in this place, their community's roots in the place, and regardless how the circumstances came to be, I don't think it is accurate to use segregation to describe it in that context. Now, of course, there's something else to consider in the context, which is that the book was published in 1975, which is just over 10 years after the Civil Rights Act had passed. And with the prevalence of Black nationalism and in some schools of Black nationalism, even Black separatism, I don't think it would have been an unpopular perception at that time that upon winning full autonomy or full independence, that some African American communities might be cautious about losing it and so stick together. Kallenbach, through the journalists, compares it to apartheid, with the difference being that the segregation is voluntary. But I think at that point you're describing different phenomena, and he also calls it an admission that races cannot live in harmony. But I think this is more of the subjective perspective of the protagonist and his personal observations. Now, what I would have liked to have seen in the book is for the protagonist to actually speak to these Black ecotopians, or speak to the Black citizens of the city-states that he is describing, to actually get their perspectives on the matter. Considering that a decade prior they had actually faced legal segregation, it is very possible that they are concerned about how much attitudes might have changed since then. And more crucially, and this is a question that Kallenbach didn't even bother to ask, what reparations can be made to heal the scars that were left by that segregation? As Malcolm X said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound the blow made. So the question is, has Ecotopia admitted that the wound is there? And well, Kallenbach doesn't say. And because he didn't explore the subjective perspectives or self-perceptions of those communities, I think I would hesitate to make any extrapolations. It's very likely, I think, that Kallenbach just didn't think about any of these things. That he didn't actually, he's not like a Black nationalist scholar or anything like that. He's not cracking open the Black Panther texts or whatever, revolutionary intercommunalism, whatever the case may be. So it's very possible he didn't know about the nuances of Black nationalism or do any of that kind of research and just decided that, you know what, I don't want to have to touch this. I don't want to have to think about this. So here, just don't want to think about racial integration. So that's it. But I mean, beyond that, to answer the question of whether that is desirable or compatible, I mean, I don't see Ecotopia even as something to aspire to. If it's one thing that disappoints me about Kallenbach's exploration is that while being quite imaginative about what Ecotopia could be, I think his imagination doesn't go far enough. I mean, it is another democratic government at the end of the day that he describes with a president and that sort of thing. That also might explain why a lot of these long marginalized African American communities might have decided to maintain some level of autonomy with these city-states, because under a statist model of governance, under a nation-state model of governance or whatever, marginalized nations often see no other way to defend their autonomy than through a nation-state of their own. When you have a situation, like when we see the breakup of, for example, the Ottoman Empire, that is because under a statist model, those various countries did not see a way, those various nations, those various people groups did not see a way to express their autonomy outside of having their own country, right? And so that's really my stance. I just feel like it demonstrates an incompleteness of Kallenbach's understanding, and I think the limits of his imagination to fully break away from these old models of thinking. But credit where credit is due. I think there are some inspiring ideas like woven within there that I recall be worth reflecting on. It's been some years since I've actually read it, but I do remember there were certain things I was like, you get a little, it gives you a little something to think about, to stew on. But yeah, I think we could go a lot further than Ecotopia goes. It has its place in the history of speculative ecological fiction, but I think we have more context and more history behind us to develop something better.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you that when I read it like a year ago, I had a very similar impression of it. But for me, it actually seems like a really good intro reading for somebody that has never even considered that the world could function in a different way in the
Yeah.
Western world. Because Ecotopia is a kind of book that me, as a person living in Western Europe, I can say to my dad, to my mom, yo, read this book, just see what you feel, see what you think about it. And then it actually produces some sort of a discussion, usually with some degree of rejection or, well, yeah, whenever I talk to my parents about any left politics, there's always some sort of a pressure on me to not talk about it and rejection of it.
Right.
But I feel like this kind of book is a good intro for
Yeah, I
for
mean,
some-
at least stimulates some level of thinking rather than the usual presentation in a lot of fiction of just capitalist realism, essentially. I mean, there are still some components, I think, of capitalist realism within Ecotopia. If I recall correctly, he doesn't really venture that far outside of, sort of business-oriented perception of the economy. But I'm speaking off the top of my head right now because I haven't read the book in a long time, so I wouldn't say anything further.
Yeah, it's a bit more intricate than that. Because they do still have free market, but they function very differently with money. Like money has a very different sort of value in the
Okay.
world. So it's a
Okay.
bit more intricate. Indeed, I direct our listeners to read the book. Check it out. It's a good read as an intro for speculative fiction in the West specifically. Indeed, it doesn't address very pressing problems that we are discussing right now, but indeed it was written like 50 years ago. Take that into account.
Yeah.
But I think now I want to direct our conversation in the direction that I keep on bringing up of talking to people who are not leftist.
Right.
So we wanted to speak a bit about your chosen format to kind of share with the world what you believe in and what you've learned. And we live in the attention economy, but at the same time, like social platforms and the digital world is seen as a new site of social change for some people in some way, although this can also be criticized. But we were wondering, who would you say your target audience is? And do you think your videos reach non-leftist leaning people?
Yeah, so I think I'll sort of address the second question first. I think I do reach non-leftist people because I think that the vast majority of people don't actively think about their politics. I think the vast majority of people are just kind of going along. I mean, the status quo is what it is. This is all they've been exposed to. And they haven't had a reason yet, or maybe they've had a reason yet, but they don't know where to turn to think of something different. And so my target audience is those people to an extent. It's people who are curious, people who love to learn, who have not attached themselves to a particular dogma, who want to explore what could be and want to oppose what is. I definitely mostly speak to people in my generation, around my age, advocates of anarchism and of decolonization and liberating education and of rewilding and of resilience. These are all different pockets by which people can sort of be funneled into my channel. Some people are very much on the environmental side of things. Some people are very much on the education side of things. But, regardless, I'm trying to just communicate my ideas in a way that is accessible to people and that gets people to think. In particular, though, I'm not sure how much utility there is necessarily in describing it as a dichotomy between an audience of leftists or an audience of non-leftists, because I sort of shy away from that sort of conception of the left, that label of the left. I am influenced by anarchism, and anarchism is anti-capitalist and anti-statist and anti-every other hierarchy. But I think it really exists outside of that paradigm. I just don't find the left umbrella term to necessarily be useful, especially when you look into the history There's discussions of why can't the left unite and why can't this not the other. But I think when you come to recognize, like, we're not necessarily speaking about different goals here. It's more like a loose association of influences. It becomes sort of freeing to me. I mean, because I'm not limited to trying to convince some sort of non-specific people to come into the left, and I'm not trying to speak to a leftist audience who may have already attached themselves to a particular ideology or dogma or whatever. When I could just speak freely, I think I'm able to more easily reach the people who have a disdain for the status quo, but don't know how to communicate it or don't know what could come next.
Yeah, I think this authenticity of the way you communicate your ideas is really something that resonated within us and why we love really to watch your videos.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to say that when you speak about not addressing any particular group, this is an issue that I've thought about a lot, because if we consider, for example, the communist revolutions, it was very evident who you had to target to induce some sort of a change in society. It was the proletariat. But nowadays, as capitalism has swallowed the proletariat, and there's actually not really a discontent, like a profoundly discontent group of people that is large enough to induce some sort of a social revolution. Who is the target group nowadays? Who do you think is going to be the catalyst, the locomotive for our change in the coming years?
That's the thing. I don't think there's ever going to be one locomotive. Going back to my perception of social revolution as this heterogeneous shift of different movements and different causes and stuff, I don't really necessarily see one particular place. For sure, if I'm looking at some of the pressures that exist in right now and some of the movements that have raised up to confront them, we can look at the ways that people have organized around like rent striking, or the ways that some people have organized around labor and things like raise the minimum wage and that sort of thing. But of course, those are piecemeal changes. They don't actively confront the foundation of the system itself. Like the rent strikes that do exist are not rent striking in order to get rid of rent. They're rent striking to reduce their rent or to improve their living conditions, to pressure the improvement to their living conditions. When you look at the worker strikes that do take place, they're not taking place in the orientation of seizing the economy into the hands of the people who are actually responsible for it and actually create it. It's more so around raising certain working standards or getting certain privileges or rights or getting certain pay raises. And those are all things that help people to survive within this system, but they're not things that necessarily seek to look beyond it. And for those situations of looking beyond it, or at least laying the foundation to look beyond it, I see some hope in La Via Campesina, which is a landless workers and peasants movement that coordinates various organizations around the world. It's really grassroots, though, bottom up, but it's sort of a collaboration between various organizations and movements around the world. And I also see some potential in the transition towns movement, which I think is also very solarpunk, which really seeks to develop people's community bonds and to develop people's resilience in the space of community and in collaboration with community to shape their urban environment and to shape their sustainability, particularly as it relates to energy and food needs. And so I think those things do create certain foundations that would allow for the transition, or would help, or are helping to facilitate rather that transition. But for one, I think many of them could stand to challenge themselves to go in a more radical direction. But then also there needs to be a greater degree of networking and collaboration and solidarity between all these causes.
Yeah, these are all really great examples to look out for. But going back to your YouTube activity and the community you've created, do you see your YouTube activity as a way of organizing?
Not really. I see it as a vehicle for educational outreach, and in a sense that is organizing, but it is definitely like lopsided. It's very one-sided. I do try to, engage with audience, but for one, this project is a one-man show. And for two, I'm really cautious around parasociality. It's really something that I am very scared of and I try my best to avoid. So I do try to engage with my audience and to share ideas and to discuss with them from time to time. It's not something, I don't want people to be focused on me. I want people to be focused on the message and then to go beyond me and to take that message and to adapt that message to their circumstances and to build on top of that message and to even change that message if they find new information that I have not observed or interacted with or engaged with, rather.
So if all of a sudden there are communities of Andrewists starting to pop up all around the world, you would not like to be associated with it.
Yeah, I think that would represent, if they're just pursuing the ideas and projects that I spend my time talking about on my channel by itself, that would be cool. The issue, if they're calling themselves Andrewists, because that would mean that I have failed totally in communicating what I intended to communicate. That, or they just ignored or misunderstood my message entirely without claiming my name.
But how do you propose to translate the knowledge that you transmit to people into direct action? Because let's say you are acting as an online info shop, right? In speaking of classical anarchist terms. So you're an online info shop, but online info shops are there to educate yourself, to get engaged and become radicalized in some sense. Do you have any propositions for your audience or for anyone who is listening right now on how to translate the knowledge that they get actually into direct action? Because I think that aspect of translating content that you get on YouTube into actual real life is a problem that a lot of the people of our age specifically struggle with.
Yeah, I have some difficulty giving people specific prescriptions of what to do with regards to direct action. Because, I mean, my audience is international and they all come from different backgrounds and contexts. So it's very hard to say, pursue this, because there are always going to be exceptions. There are always going to be like differences in their conditions that might provide proven obstacle or maybe something that I cannot directly address in such a broad brush prescription. I think I want people to look at their specific and unique context, like whether they're in school, whether they're in a workplace, what kind of workplace they're in, what their industry is, what's, urban or suburban or rural context they find themselves in, and look beyond me and look at, keeping in mind the principles that I talk about, look at what can be done in those contexts. Because a recommendation that I would give a student in secondary school or university would be different from a recommendation that I would give somebody in a field like in an industry like agriculture, which would be different from a recommendation I would give somebody in an office job, which would be different from a recommendation I would give somebody in an apartment building versus sprawling suburbia. I mean, different strokes for different folks, different activities for different contexts, and I think it would just depend upon people not necessarily waiting for instructions, but rather going beyond and looking to see what others have done and what, both in past and present, and what could be done,
That's an interesting take on it. So I wish you were more concrete. And I know that in one of the videos you've spoken about the fact that you actually have had experience organizing while being a student yourself. And let's just imagine for a second that probably our target audience or our factual audience is mostly students. Can you share your experiences of organizing as a student? And could you maybe give some advice to the people who would like to get engaged on how they could do that?
Sure. So when I was organizing as a student, it was definitely one of the most challenging organizing experiences that I had. In the end, I don't think that we accomplished anything that we set out to accomplish. And that is something that I'm still stewing with. Part of the issue, I think, with organizing students or attempting to organize students is that they really have to be like genuinely invested in getting a particular project done. Because I didn't accomplish anything organizing as a student, I can really speak from the position of criticizing what I did, right? For example, we formed this group and the group was meant to start off as just like a general, we were going to start off with a protest. And then after the protest, we were going to look at starting to do either educational work or starting to build like certain permaculture related or permaculture-related infrastructure in schools, or looking to develop like microgrids or doing fundraising to develop certain energy systems so that schools would be energy independent and that we would have opportunities to speak to the student body and develop the analysis of the climate change situation, because it was a climate change oriented group, and to hopefully get more people on board and that sort of thing. The challenge with that is that it was like me and one other person who were like actually doing anything, and then everybody else was not. And that part of the difficulty with organizing students is that students often have a lot of schoolwork to do, homework or assignments or whatever the case may be. And in particular, these were secondary school students, and they were preparing for their final exams. So that was an additional obstacle to getting anything done. They were preparing for their final exams, and they had lessons, and they had assignments and tests and all these different things going on. We didn't have the buy-in of the people to actually see anything come to fruition. In fact, in retrospect, it honestly felt as if a lot of people were just there so that they had something to put on like their college essay or their resume to say that, oh, when I was in secondary school, I was part of this group, let me into your college. You know, it's like not necessarily doing anything significant. So that was pretty disappointing.
I imagine that the word anarchy was not in the name of the club, because that's not something I want to put on my CV, bro.
Nah. Even back then, I was an anarchist, and so I was trying to, part of talking to these people was like, or organizing these people was like sharing like my perspective, not like impose my perspective saying, oh, you know, this is this, but, you know, we were trying to facilitate discussions of these issues, and so I shared my perspective on things like that, and people were receptive. But we had all these meetings and we had all these discussions, but we took minutes, we had discussions, we had certain things that we had to accomplish by the next meeting, and things didn't really, you know, pan out. I think if I were to recommend what to do differently, I would say that it would be best to find people who are actually engaged with the project, and more specifically, organize around a specific goal. We kind of had things backwards, where we formed a group and then we decided to try and find a goal for the group to accomplish. When in reality, what might have been easier, might have been better to say the states that, you know, I or me and one other person, like, we are trying to accomplish this task. Who's in? Who's willing to contribute? How can you contribute? That sort of thing. And work from there. Because I think a lot of time was just spent talking, trying to figure out what to do and not actually doing anything. So find a particular project you want to initiate. And I think start off small. You know, like the ideas that we were starting off with, I mean, one of the things was just like running an educational social media platform. And then the other things were developing like food forests or permaculture gardens in every school, and developing like renewable energy in every school. And so I think we were biting off more than we could chew. I mean, I lied a bit earlier. We did accomplish one thing. That one thing that we accomplished was briefly maintaining a social media presence. So we did pour a lot of energy into that, but it didn't go anywhere beyond that. In fact, rather than fixating on the branding of the group or the establishment of the group, the visibility of the group, I think it would have been better if we just spent our energy focusing on what we could actually accomplish based on our resources, and using those small victories to build forward into larger things.
Yeah, I think that's a question that a lot of people who are eager for things to change and eager for people to like gain consciousness of how it's important to just change the way things are and create a more egalitarian society is the question of like, yeah, getting people to realize things. So in your experience, just in general, in your life experience, what do you usually do with people who are indifferent or pessimistic or who don't believe in change? What do you tell them?
I think for pessimists, there's really only so much talk that you can talk. Some pessimists, I think, can be moved by just communicating with them, you know, examples of change being possible, showing them case studies or situations in history and in the present where people have been able to imagine and act upon a different vision of the world, and perhaps looking into ways that vision and that action can be expanded to encompass greater regions and greater portions of the earth, and to to develop the power to be able to challenge the present status quo. I think for some people, for some pessimists, it really is a matter of seeing is believing. You actually have to prove to them through actions, through your efforts, show them through experience the change is possible. There are, of course, the people who just by default, more optimistic, and so they are a bit easier to move. And I think you should start with working with them because you really can't organize with people who are indifferent. People who are indifferent don't organize. You have to start with the people who are willing and who are interested. And then through the work that you do with those people, you can build on top of that and demonstrate to others that, hey, you could be a part of this too. This is possible. We
Yeah.
can, do more.
Yeah, and I think the notion of privilege here is quite important in this discussion around resisting the status quo, because obviously not everyone in this world wants to do that, wants to change things. Some people are kind of good with how things roll. And this is something that we discussed with David Bell in the episode number 2, in his conceptualization of utopia. He explains that social change is often brought out by marginalized communities because for them the reality becomes impossible. So they have no choice but to be subversive. And this kind of survival response generates new ways of living and being. So if we take the climate crisis, which kind of unites us all in different ways, which communities do you see as being the most capable of bringing about serious shifts?
Yes, I think you're right in recognizing that people with privilege, they can't move what doesn't want to be moved,
Yeah.
Thankfully, there are people with privileged backgrounds who do push back against their privilege, but they aren't the people that we can stake our movement on because they're often either co-opted for their own ends or they end up being flaky. The change makers often going to be change makers by necessity. Marginalized communities are change makers by necessity. Island cultures, by necessity, we have to start developing the tools to mitigate. We are at the most precarious, the
Yeah.
most vulnerable positions. In sub-Saharan Africa, where the Sahel and the Sahara are expanding, the permaculture projects that are taking place there to push back at the Sahara, they're doing so by necessity, and they're innovating and finding ways to resolve this issue.
Yeah.
In India as well, there are projects related to permaculture that I think also provide an example of necessity being the mother of invention, the driving force of change.
Thanks for that answer. We all kind of hope to see communities inspiring each other and becoming examples of how we can create better worlds, whether it's on a local level or something bigger. But here's something to think about. Imagine we actually get there, where ecologically and socially just societies have become the norm and life gets better for most people. Even then, there might still be pushback. Like, there could be people or groups totally against this way of living. It's interesting because this kind of comes up in Ecotopia as well, where even in this utopian setup, there are people actively resisting the progress that has been made. And it reminded me of something you mentioned in one of your videos, this idea of schismogenesis, where people define themselves by opposing another group, and that's how social divisions happen. Do you think that if we manage to build these ecologically and socially just societies, we could see a backlash? Like, could we end up with opposition parties demanding a return to how things were before?
Yeah, I think there might always be contrarians, might always be people who oppose this ecologically and socially just world. But for one, and I see this often when people raise this concern, not saying that you are, but there are some people who raise this concern as if societies should then organize themselves around like responding to these people or accommodating these people. And if we're talking about an ecologically and socially just society, in my philosophy, that would be an anarchic society. And in such a context, I don't believe that just because they oppose such a society, that they would have the means necessarily to effectively uproot it. I mean, there's something that I also intend to talk about with regard to the inertia developed by certain social systems, and the fact that the predominance of certain values necessarily reinforce themselves. So if we're living in a hierarchical society, hierarchical values reinforce themselves because people are overwhelmingly exposed to hierarchical modes of organizing and modes of domination and control and exploitation, all these different things. Whereas in an anarchic society, you have a situation where the predominance of anarchic modes of organizing and institutions and structures will necessarily be oriented around, or rather will necessarily produce people or shape people's values in those directions. And so if we've reached this point of anarchy, of a socially just and ecologically just society, then we have had to do the work already to develop a consciously anti-hierarchical culture. And having that culture in place would make it very difficult, even in the case of schismogenesis, where opposition still arises, it would be very difficult for them to still come into place and assert themselves as an authority and seek to make changes to undo the progress that has been made. I don't think that the people who have fought so hard for an ecologically and socially just world will just lie back and take the erasure of all of their efforts. On top of that, I think that hierarchical societies are uniquely vulnerable to the disruption of social and ecological justice, even if hierarchical societies were capable of achieving what I would consider an acceptable standard of social and ecological justice. I think that those societies are uniquely vulnerable to the disruption of that justice by bad actors, because those hierarchical societies provide the exact structures and means that would be necessary to command others and thus extend the impact of those persons' negative and destructive actions much further than they would be able to accomplish without those mechanisms to support them.
Interesting point. You brought up the question that I wanted to ask as a follow-up, what the difference is between dismantling the hierarchical and capitalist system versus dismantling something that has been achieved through these kind of systems. But I suppose indeed that you're right. If we're talking about anarchy-based societies, that it's really difficult because it's super decentralized.
Yeah, I think people have a misconception when they're first introduced to anarchy that it's just the absence of hierarchy. But that's only half of the picture. It's the absence of hierarchy, yes. And to the extent to which that ideal can be achieved is something that we will have to strive towards and find out. But it's not just the absence of hierarchy, it's also the presence of anti-hierarchical modes of social organization, consciously horizontal modes of social organization. If you look at some of the societies that are the tribal societies, for example, who are currently egalitarian, it's not just a matter of, nobody has ever tried to assert themselves as a king or a chief in such societies. It's a matter of you don't have the ability to assert yourself as such because nobody will respect that authority. Authority is the recognized right to command others and to demand obedience. And without that recognition, if there were a snap of a finger, a case where everybody across the world decided not to listen to any authority, there would be nothing that the authorities could do to prevent that, to stop that. The authority relies on the obedience of their foot soldiers in the police and the military to maintain their authority. And if those institutions did not observe, did not recognize that authority, if those institutions did not exist, if they were dismantled by the people that were once part of them and they suddenly decided to reject the system of police and all these different things, if the police decided to abolish themselves, which is, an unlikely situation, but if that were the case, there would be nothing that the ruling class could do to prevent that because they rule because their right to rule is accepted. And again, it goes back to this idea of the inertia of hierarchical systems, how they carry themselves on, so that even if there are individuals within those systems who question and wish to resist, they're unable to stand alone against that tide. And so it requires a similarly powerful tide to push back against that and to, prompt people to actually question the recognition of that right to rule, to completely dismantle this idea that anybody has the right to rule or to command subordination.
Thank you, Andrew, for this really fascinating explanation of what anarchism really is. I think it's quite important to understand that it's really more than being against and being anti-status quo. It's for kind of reminding us that it's mainly about building new models that will make the old one outdated. So We're almost at the end of the episode. I wanted to ask you about your relationship with art because you're also a poet, Andrew. So, how does art inform your political philosophy? And in a solarpunk future, what role do you see art as playing?
Well, art definitely accompanies all my work. So I definitely use art to communicate my political philosophy. I can't really say that it informs my political philosophy beyond my desire to see art liberated from the shackles of the consumer economy. In a sort of a future, for me, I think art would be free. Humans have always been artists, even since our cave painting days. And so I think we would see more people making art to beautify their immediate environments in particular. And I think we would see more opportunities and spaces available to express one's art. And of course, more free time to hone your craft.
Yeah, hopefully in a solarpunk world, being an artist will be a bit easier. Andrew, thank you so much for being here. Let's finish off with our final question. What gives you hope, Andrew?
I draw my hope in part from the ideas I've seen come to fruition in pockets and corners of the world, in looking at the successes of small groups to make big changes. But mostly, I draw my hope from others. In fact, I think hope is mutually reinforcing. Right now, I think about how my work gives hope to my audience. And in receiving that work and being moved by it to act, in the comments telling me the ways that my work has helped them and has pushed them to act, my audience then gives that hope back to me. And then that cycle repeats itself. The same, of course, is true for despair, which is why, even though I have my moments of despair, I really avoid communicating them publicly, because despair can also be mutually reinforcing. And so if I want to see more hope in the world and see more hope for a better world, my part to play in that is to put forward and to put out hope, to counteract the influence of despair.